Gork and Mork, the twin gods of the orc race. One is brutally cunning, while the other is cunningly brutal. They are two of the most talked about and mysterious gods in all of Warhammer 40k. So I thought it was finally about time a falling cow took a swing at power scaling these big green gits. And hey, if this video hits over 1,000 likes and 300 comments within the first week, I'll make a follow-up video power scaling the great green prophet himself, Gazgul Mak Uruk Thraka. So make sure you smash that like button and drop a comment below. But in today's video, we're focusing on his benefactors, Gork and Mork. I'm going to break down who they are, their powers, weapons, and abilities, their greatest feats across the setting, and finally where they scale compared to the rest of the 40k universe. So there's only one thing left to do. It's time to wag out and jump headfirst into the cow hole. It's time to power scale. Gork and Mork are the twin gods of the orc race, born from the collective traits, emotions, and beliefs of the greenskin race. Just as Khorne is a manifestation of violence, anger, and bloodshed across the galaxy, Gork and Mork are the ultimate reflection of the orcs themselves. Every orc's love for battle, violence, cunning, and conquest feeds back into the warp, empowering the twin gods. At the end of the day, Gork and Mork are pretty much the purest expression of what it means to be an orc. And the same gestalt psychic energy that empowers Gork and Mork is also responsible for many of the strange abilities and unexplained phenomenon surrounding the orc race. As the 10th edition Orc Codex states, when orcs gather, a very strange phenomenon manifests. A kind of gestalt energy builds, a supernatural charge like the tension before a thunderstorm, exciting the orcs' rakshas and violent tendencies even as it feeds off them. Some amongst the Imperium have hypothesized that this energy lies at the heart of the many inexplicable facets of the orc's essential nature. Orcs, for their part, couldn't care less. To them, this is simply the power of the wag. This wag energy is the psychic force created by the collective thoughts, emotions, and beliefs of the greenskin race. The more orcs gather, fight, and believe in their own unstoppable nature, the stronger this energy becomes. It is the same force that connects the orcs to Gork and Mork, and allows their race to perform many of the bizarre feats that defy normal logic. This is also what makes Gork and Mork so different from the Chaos Gods. While the ruinous pantheon are fueled by the emotions and actions of countless species across the galaxy, Gork and Mork are almost entirely the reflection of one race, the orcs. They do not seek souls, offer mutations, or care about the grand schemes like the other four Chaos Gods. Instead, they simply embody everything the orcs are: violence, conquest, and the endless pursuit of a good scrap. In fact, they spend most of their time in the warp physically punching each other in an eternal stalemate, which you have to admit is a pretty damn orky thing to do. Now, the difference between the two gods is very subtle. One of them is brutally cunning, and the other is cunningly brutal. The orcs often disagree over which is which, and they have even started wars over this matter. But thankfully, we do have a definitive answer on which is which, as seen in the 10th edition Orc Codex. Gork is said to be brutal but cunning. He will not stand for anything he sees as mucking about, which is generally interpreted by the orcs as anything from bothering to formulate a battle plan to using high-tech weaponry or fighting for any reason other than the simple joy of violence. Gork is the divine equivalent of a boot to the teeth, a brace of stink bombs through a stained glass window, or a rocket-propelled asteroid dropped onto an enemy city. In short, he epitomizes the most fundamental essence of what it means to be an orc. So if Gork represents the idea of a straightforward fight, smacking, bashing, and whacking anything in his path, Mork, on the other hand, represents the other side of the orc psyche, cunning, which is also seen in the 10th edition Orc Codex. Mork is said to be cunning but brutal. Rather than just bash his enemies over the head, Mork would rather sneak up on them with his enormous club behind his back than bash them over the head. He is of course still a deity of loud and apocalyptic destruction. He just likes to be a bit sneaky about it. We're hunting Chaos Gods! Mork is the orc's bestial cunning personified. the glee of the greenskin species to shock and confuse their luckless foes. So essentially, Gork is the guy who comes up, yells at you, and smacks you in the face, while Mork is the guy who comes up behind you, yells, and smacks you in the back of the head. Now naturally, the next question we must ask is, when did Gork and Mork come into being? And while the answer is rather complicated, as always with Warhammer 40k, since the warp exists outside of normal time, technically speaking, Gork and Mork have existed forever and have never existed at all. Yeah, I know, confusing, right? Though in the book The Beast Must Die, when Vulcan absorbs the pure gestalt energy of the Wag, he sees Gork and Mork fighting at the dawn of time. That power echoed back through time, past the Horse Heresy to the primordial origins of the orcs themselves. He was one with the nature of the orcs, and saw for the briefest moment two greenskin behemoths battering each other with bare fists at the dawn of time, before even mankind was born. So it does appear that Gork and Mork have existed, or at the very least, were born within the warp sometime in the very ancient past. The most likely theory is that this occurred around the same time the Krorks came into being during the War in Heaven. Now for those who don't know, the Krorks are the ancient orcs, and were created by the Old Ones during the War in Heaven to combat the Necrons and the Catan. Now I will admit there is no direct evidence that the Krorks specifically worshipped Gork and Mork, or that they had a direct hand in their creation. So I can't outright confirm that they were the Krorks' gods during this era. There are even some theories that, similar to the Eldar gods, Gork and Mork were created by the Old Ones to empower the Krorks with their gestalt psychic energy, since you know they were literally fighting star gods. If that were the case, then theoretically they could also be capable of manifesting in the material realm, just like some of the Eldar gods did during the War in Heaven. But like I said, unfortunately, there is no direct evidence to support this incredibly cool theory. Curse you, Games Workshop! Curse you! In addition to that, there is also some rather conflicting information from older Warhammer lore. As in the 1990s Orc Wag Codex, Gork and Mork are described as awakening and beginning to influence the orcs across the galaxy. But with more recent lore establishing their existence as ancient warp deities tied to the very nature of the orc race, this older codex appears to have been retconned or heavily reworked. But what I can say with confidence is that Gork and Mork have existed for a very, very long time, potentially dating back to the earliest origins of the orc race. As for their appearances, Gork and Mork are warp entities, so technically speaking, they do not have one standard physical form, though they are most commonly depicted as gigantic orcs, which is supported by the fact that the orcs build their colossal, gargant, and stompa war machines in their image.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
So now that we know who Gork and Mork are, it's time to move on to discussing their abilities, weapons, and feats throughout Warhammer 40k. So I know we just discussed where their powers come from, but I'm going to briefly summarize it because it is important when discussing Gork and Mork's abilities. So as I said earlier, it does appear that Gork and Mork only gain their power through the orcs, and the orcs alone. Essentially how this works is as more and more greenskins fight across the galaxy, screaming their cries of war and death, charging into battle, and simply getting into a good scrap, the more empowered their deities become. Every single orc, grot, and snotling acts as a tiny psychic transmitter and receiver. When millions of orcs gather, fight, and chant together, their collective subconscious thoughts coalesce into the Wag field, feeding raw, belligerent psychic energy straight into the warp and empowering Gork and Mork. Now before moving on, I do want to touch on if the orcs actually empower the Chaos Gods as well as Gork and Mork, which is a very surprisingly controversial subject, since we do have sources that suggest they don't, and we do have sources that suggest they absolutely do.
Huh?
So, just like usual in 40k, it's a confusing mess. For example, in the book Brutal Cunning, a demon of Khorne has this to say about fighting the orcs. The abhorrence, living, thinking beings over which the true powers could hold little influence. Resistant to the hated changer, resistant to the grandfather disease, and resistant to the snares of excess cast by the Dark Prince. Even the Blood God, mightiest of the ruinous powers, could not offer them any outlet for their warlike nature that was not provided by their worship of their own brutish gods. The abhorrence proliferated, vermin with an infuriating inability to acknowledge the power of chaos. So from this, it appears that orcs are inherently resistant to the powers of chaos, or at the very least, highly resistant to corruption, as their souls appear incapable of being influenced by the ruinous pantheon. And the demon makes it appear that Gork and Mork are the main reason for that. However, Ark of Omen's Angron presents what seems to be the exact opposite. While describing the kinds of battle that empower Khorne, which is, spoiler, it's all of them, it includes this example. They strike in anger. The brawl in the fighting pit has been long and bruising, but at last the challenger lies bloody and broken. Giving full vent to his fury at this upstart, the orc hefts a boulder in both hands and brings it crashing down upon his enemy's skull. Now, Ark of Omen's Angron was published in 2023, while Brutal Cunning came out in 2021. Whether that's an intentional shift in lore or simply another contradiction is difficult to say. Personally though, it honestly makes more sense that orcs would be able to empower chaos. I don't think intent is what matters. It's the emotional and psychic output of sentient beings. What makes the orcs unique isn't necessarily that they don't feed chaos at all. It's that they are incredibly difficult to corrupt. Their devotion to Gork and Mork, combined with their unique psychic nature, makes them exceptionally resistant to the influence of the ruinous pantheon. In addition to being empowered by all orc kind, Gork and Mork are of course warp entities, meaning they possess many of the same fundamental abilities as the other warp gods, like we see in the 4th edition Chaos Demons Codex. The realm of chaos is a place of dreams and nightmares, where cause need not follow effect. Within its bounds, anything is possible. Here, there are no physical laws akin to those that dominate the mortal world. Within its confines, hopes and fears become real, and reality is reborn as fevered hallucination. Gravity, shape, space, and reason all are in flux and utterly mutable to the will of the Chaos Gods. So like I just said, Gork and Mork, as warp entities, should be able to manipulate any concept within the warp. That includes time, space, reality, causality, gravity, pretty much anything that is a fundamental aspect of our world is at the complete mercy of warp beings like Gork and Mork. In addition to this, like the Chaos Gods, Gork and Mork can create their own realm within the Immaterium. Just as Khorne rules over his brass citadel and Tzeentch commands the crystalline labyrinth, Gork and Mork preside over their own domain, the Great Green. As described in Gazgul Thraka, prophet of the Wag, the Great Green is the spiritual fungoid realm where Gork and Mork reside. It is also the destination of every green-skinned soul after death. They're the spirits of orcs, snotlings, and other orc subspecies remain until Gork and Mork decide to reincarnate them into new bodies. Just like the Chaos Gods, this realm corresponds to the power, will, and essence of Gork and Mork. So depending on how powerful they are at that current moment in time, their realm size will shrink and expand depending on how empowered they are. So say for example during the War of the Beast, Gork and Mork's realm was probably gigantic, but after the shattering of the orc hosts, their realm probably shrunk due to the loss of so much Wog energy. Outside of these standard warp abilities, Gork and Mork have also been seen aiding the orcs within the physical world through multiple means. For example, they appear to influence where orcs travel, and may even offer them a degree of protection while journeying through the Immaterium. In fact, in the 7th edition Orc Codex, they seemingly possess a group of Gazgul Thraka's weird boys, and through them, they command Gazgul that the material realm must be conquered by the orcs. After this, they seem to send Gazgul across the galaxy to fulfill their scheme. Their message delivered, the weird boys explode in ripe showers of wet viscera, and a tide of green power rolls outwards from them, frying every system on Gazgul's ship and crippling his pursuers. Kill Rekka is immediately hurled into warp space, emerging somewhere and somewhen else entirely. Now this warp jump drops Gazgul into the heart of the powerful orc warlord Urgok the Slayer's territory. So naturally, Ghazghul immediately heads to the center of his empire, teleports aboard Dust Slayer's warship, kills his bodyguard, and claims his wog, resulting in what the Codex describes as the stirring of an orc migration on a scale never before seen. So it definitely appears that Gork and Mork can manipulate warp travel to further their own goals and desires. This is further supported by the 10th edition Orc Codex, which states that as orc ships travel through warp space, they are protected by Gork and Mork. As they enter warp space, the text states they trust to Gork and Mork that they will emerge from the Inferium near, if not on top of, some settled planetary system that they can invade. This once again suggests that Gork and Mork both protect the orcs as they travel through the warp and influence where they emerge, ensuring they almost always find themselves heading towards a fresh scrap or a new battle. Gork and Mork also seem to have the ability to empower their champions in the material world, especially when they are in need of it the most. Most notably, Ghazghul is greatly blessed as their direct champion and prophet. For example, in the 9th edition Orc Codex, we are told, to face Ghazghul Thraka in battle is to die. This ironclad engine of destruction is not only terrifying in combat, but he is also a totemic war leader of great cunning and terrifying presence. If this was not enough, Ghazghul also enjoys the personal protection of the Orc gods. Not that he seems to need it. And there are multiple statements like this one throughout the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th edition Orc Codexes, all of which directly show that Gork and Mork can bestow their power and strength upon their chosen orcs. Most of all Ghazghul Thraka, who they quite literally speak to guide him towards their goals. Not only can they do this with whichever orc they choose, but it also seems to correlate with their ultimate goal, for the orcs to wage so much war and slaughter across the galaxy that their wog energy grows so fierce and ferocious that the barrier between real space and the warp begins to fail, allowing Gork and Mork to finally enter the fray in the material universe. As the 7th edition Orc Codex states, at their behest, Ghazghul is beginning his greatest work. He will travel the galaxy, subjugating every warlord and gathering every orc to his banner until the stars themselves shudder to the thundering footfalls of his horde. Ghazghul is gathering the Wog of Gork and Mork themselves. A Wog that will drown the galaxy in a war so great that the gods themselves will tear their way out of the warp to join the fight. So this does appear to support the theory that Gork and Mork may be very similar to the ancient Eldari gods, like Asurian or Cain, and that they may actually be able to manifest within real space if their power becomes great enough. Meaning that if the orcs become the dominant species within the material universe, Gork and Mork could potentially swell in power, at least if this codex entry is to be believed, enough to breach the barrier between the warp and real space, enter the battle themselves, and take the galaxy for all orc kind. Will this ever happen though? Probably not, since the orcs are a far cry from the main characters of the setting. But it doesn't hurt to dream, right guys? Right?
No.
So now that we've talked about their abilities, do Gork and Mork wield any weapons? And this is kind of a weird question because technically, it has never been outright confirmed what their weapons are called or what exactly they can do. However, in the 10th edition Orc Codex, Mork is described as sneaking up behind his enemies and hitting them with an enormous club. Gork, on the other hand, is also described in the 7th edition Orc Codex to use a giant spike club the size of a comet to destroy his enemies. So truly, these are the perfect weapons for a good scrap. But unfortunately, we don't know the full extent of either club or what they are able to do. But we can assume, as they are a god's weapon, that they are quite powerful. But there are no feats or statements that give us a clear idea of their actual power or how destructive they are, which absolutely is a bummer. But that is the reality of the orcs in 40k. Always yelling, but always forgotten by Games Workshop. Moving on, let's next talk about Gork and Mork's feats across 40k. And I'm going to admit that too is a little confusing. First, in the 7th edition Orc Codex, we get this excerpt, which on the surface looks quite insane. The orcs say that Gork is brutal but cunning, and Mork is cunning but brutal. Gork and Mork are divine powerhouses. Deities so strong, they are never truly defeated. They simply shrug off the attacks of other gods with a raucous laugh. So at first glance, this codex entry makes it appear that Gork and Mork are so powerful that they can simply shrug off attacks from other gods. However, when you look at it a little bit more closely, it never specifies which gods it's talking about. And this is consistent with pretty much every single orc codex, since Games Workshop is apparently too lazy to change the description, as every single codex has just stated gods. This is seen from the 4th edition all the way to the most recent orc codex, which is the 10th. We don't know whether that includes the Ruinous Powers, the Emperor, or anyone else. It just says gods. Now for all the angry orc fans out there, this is like saying I could beat any soccer player in a 1v1. Does any player include my grandma, who can hardly walk? And does it also include Messi, one of the greatest soccer players to ever play? You see what I mean? There are dozens of gods and godlike entities within the warp, and some of them are incredibly powerful, while others are random, obscure, or barely even known. So we simply don't know which gods this text is referring to. Now this excerpt does state that Gork and Mork are indeed divine powerhouses, and are powerful enough to exist within the warp while never truly being defeated. Which is still impressive as hell, as they are sharing a space with the Ruinous Pantheon, as well as the God Emperor of mankind. I will say that this is about it in terms of recent codex feats. But thankfully for Gork and Mork, older lore does them a lot of favors. As for example, in the Rogue Trader Wog, or codex that came out in 1990, we get this statement. In orc mythology, the two gods, Gork and Mork, regularly confront the powers of chaos and the gods of the other alien races. Gork and Mork are never defeated. They simply shrug off the blows of the other gods and laugh at them. Then Gork grins, bares his teeth, and lands a mighty blow on the head of his adversary with his gigantic club. Similarly, Mork, the master of low cunning, clobbers his foes when they aren't looking. It is not surprising that the orc gods are seen triumphing over chaos powers, because in battle, the orc weird boys triumph over their demonic and human servants. Demons and psychers are frequently laid low by the psychic attacks of the weird boys. So yeah, this 1990s codex seems to change exactly what the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th edition orc codexes state, as it actually does elaborate on which gods Gork and Mork are facing, stating that they regularly confront the Ruinous Powers and other alien gods, which would include the God Emperor, stating that they shrug off their attacks and laugh at them.
I'm the guy.
Stop saying you're the guy. We all know that you're not the guy.
He's not the guy. I am.
So, does that mean Gork and Mork are easily overpowering the Chaos Gods and even the Emperor? Well, hold your horses, as there are a couple of different ways you can interpret this statement. One interpretation is that since the later orc codexes do not include this additional context, you could argue indeed that because the Rogue Trader Wog 1990 orc codex is more specific, the codexes that follow are simply condensing the information. Therefore, the gods mentioned in later codexes could potentially be referring to the same entities described in this older 1990 codex. But of course, there are other ways to view it, as the codex entry itself begins by saying this is orc mythology, and orcs are hardly the most reliable source of information when it comes to accurately describing the power levels of their gods. Then there is also the obvious fact that this codex came out in the 1990s, which, if you're good at math, came out almost 40 years ago. Yeah, I can't believe that either. Jesus Christ. It's gonna be 2030 soon, fellas. Oh my god, I am old. And since then, a lot of Warhammer lore has changed. Though I will say nothing outright contradicts this older lore, but newer codex entries provide a very different perspective. For example, in the 8th edition Chaos Demons Codex, we get this. The most powerful and dangerous of the Warp Denizens were the 4 great gods of chaos: Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh, and their legions of demons. They desired only the destruction of the galaxy and longed to possess every living soul. So this becomes a classic case of old lore versus new lore. And obviously newer lore generally takes precedence when discussing the current state of the setting. Ultimately, it comes down to how you want to interpret this statement. And that interpretation will become a huge part of scaling Gork and Mork later in this video. So make sure you remember that statement. Outside of this, Gork and Mork have a few more feats from that 1990s codex, including one involving Nurgle, the Plague God. This feat is titled The Hunt, and it goes something like this. Gork and Mork go looking for a gigantic squiggly beast and find it at the bottom of a huge cesspit. Also at the bottom of the cesspit is Nurgle, who has eaten all the snotlings. Gork and Mork clobber Nurgle so hard that he spews up all the snotlings who are still alive. Nurgle shrinks and becomes a squiggly beast. The snotlings then turn the squig into a feast for Gork and Mork. This myth clearly represents the orc triumph over Nurgle. The orcs have no fear of the realms of Nurgle and happily thrive on squiggly beasts that breed in their cesspits. So for all of you orc fans tweaking and saying, oh my god, there you go, Fallen Cow, Gork and Mork did indeed fight and beat a Chaos God. Eat it, cow, eat it. What are you gonna do now? You gotta place him at the top of your pyramid. And I'm just gonna look at you a little strange for a moment and say, well, hold on to your squigs, lads. Because, as the orcs would say, this scrap isn't finished yet. The codex outright says, look at it closely, this myth, yes, this myth, clearly represents the orc triumph over Nurgle. The orcs have no fear over the realms of Nurgle and happily thrive on squiggly beasts that breed in their cesspits. The key word here is myth. This is clearly a symbolic story about how orcs view chaos, and specifically how they have no fear of Nurgle and his domain. It is not necessarily a literal account of Gork and Mork jumping Nurgle and kicking the shit out of him. So unfortunately, no, orc fans, Nurgle did not canonically lose to Gork and Mork. I apologize, but facts are unfortunately facts. In that same 1990s codex, which honestly seems to be the only piece of lore where Gork and Mork actually receive any major feats,
someone cooked here.
We get another story called Here We Go, which also has another pretty cool feat. Gork and Mork look up into the sky and see another planet shining among the stars. Mork challenges Gork to knock it down with his club. Gork hurls his club for all it's worth, but forgets that it's tied to his wrist. The club sails towards the planet with Gork following after. Mork grabs hold of Gork and goes as well. So besides sounding like a skit straight out of Dumb and Dumber, this does indeed imply that Gork and Mork are potentially able to destroy planets with their weapons. However, we never actually see them accomplish this, and the feat is only once again featured as a tale, so it may not even be true. And that is about it when it comes to major feats for Gork and Mork, which if you're an orc fan has got to be pretty damn disappointing. How the hell are the orcs twin deities, who are arguably probably some of the most powerful entities in the entire setting, getting most of their feats from a codex released in 1990? Seriously, GW, what the hell happened here? Even in recent lore, for example in the book Godblight, Gork and Mork are strangely absent when Gilliman and his advisors are talking about warp beings. They mention the Chaos Gods, the Emperor, and even the Tyranid Hivemind. Yet despite being some of the oldest and most powerful warp entities, Gork and Mork are sadly left on the sidelines and are not even brought up at all. But that is besides the point. If anything, I hope Games Workshop sees this video, see how unfairly they've treated the great Gits, and give them some new lore. But now that we've talked about their abilities, weapons, and lack of feats, finally we can get to scaling them against the rest of the 40k universe. Before we talk about where the two biggest gits in the warp sit, Gork and Mork, we need to lay out the almighty, wog-powered, green-skinned, probably held together by duct tape and pure orc belief, best part of this video, a cow's power pyramid with the same tiers as always. At the bottom, we have the Chapter Master tier. This is where you'll find your standard orc war bosses, Elder Exarchs, and Space Marine Chapter Masters. Above that is the Enhanced tier. Here you'll find your standard Adeptus Custodian, the Swarm Lord, along with the greatest mortal warriors of the galaxy, like Lilith Hesperax, the Queen of Knives. And sitting at the very top of the Enhanced tier is Trajan Valoris, the Captain General of the Custodes, who I view as the true gatekeeper of the Enhanced tier. Next comes the Primarch tiers, and I do need to clarify something here first, because a lot of people got confused last time. When I say base Primarch, I'm talking about the Primarchs at their standard Great Crusade era peak, when they are unamped, unaltered, and operating at their normal baseline. So this is not counting Primarchs like Lionel Johnson in the current setting with the Emperor's Shield, or Sanguinius during the Siege of Terra, when he practically can't die due to his impending fight with Horus Lubercal. So our first Primarch tier is the low Primarch tier, which includes the mightiest named greater demons like Skarbrand, Angorath, or Kugath Plaguefather, as well as most avatars of Cain and the weaker base Primarchs like Lorgar, Alfarius, Omegon, and Rabute Gilliman. After that comes the high Primarch tier, where we find the stronger base Primarchs like Sanguinius, the Lion, Horus, Leman Russ, Conrad Kurz, Vulcan, and Angron. After that, we reach the planetary tier, which includes Transcendent Catan Shards and the Demon Primarchs. Above that is the Cosmic tier, where we find beings like the Silent King and the Emperor in 30k. And finally, at the very top, we reach the newly titled God tier, the absolute peak of Warhammer 40k. This is where we find God Emperor Horus, the Chaos Gods, the fully formed Catan, and the Emperor upon the Golden Throne. These are entities whose influence and power stretches across realities, timelines, possibilities, fate, and the very structure of existence. But now comes the real question. Where do the twin gods of the orcs fit into my cow's power pyramid? Well, instead of really dragging this out, let's try to get everyone home for dinner. Since Gork and Mork are gods, and are empowered by an entire race of beings, I don't think any simple chapter master or custodian would be able to stand against them. So because of this, they easily scale above the chapter master, enhanced, Primarch, planetary, and cosmic tiers. Meaning, the real question we need to ask is, where do they sit in the god tier? And to be honest, I think they sit at the very bottom. Yes, I know what you're thinking. What the hell, cow? Doesn't that 1990s codex say they are easily fighting the Chaos Gods? Well, first off, listen to yourself. The 1990 codex, you're saying the 36-year-old codex is going to support them being higher than the Chaos Gods?
No.
Now don't get me wrong, that lore is worth discussing, and it gives Gork and Mork some pretty insane statements, because you know they have no other feats outside of that book apparently.
You can't keep getting away with this!
But when we look at more recent lore, multiple codexes consistently establish that the Chaos Gods are the strongest entities within the warp. For example, the 5th edition Warhammer rulebook states, secondly, warp space is not empty, but inhabited by many strange and dangerous beings, the most dangerous of which are the great gods of chaos and their terrible legions of demons. So no, the Chaos Gods are still likely beyond Gork and Mork. And honestly, even without those codex statements, the scaling argument just makes more sense. While Gork and Mork are fueled by the emotions, beliefs, and the psychic energy of the entire orc race, the Chaos Gods are empowered by the emotions, beliefs, and actions of all sentient beings across the galaxy. Their domains are not limited to one race. They are empowered by universal concepts that affect all beings in the galaxy. So no, the Chaos Gods are not weaker than Gork and Mork. Next, the Emperor is another very interesting comparison, but based on the statements I recently found in the End and the Death trilogy, combined with his feats throughout the Plague Wars, the God Emperor upon the Golden Throne has a very legitimate argument for being stronger than the Chaos Gods, at least individually. I know that sounds like quite the truth bomb, but you're just gonna have to wait for my power scaling the Emperor video coming out later this month. And it may or may not be 3 hours long, and it may or may not have some really crazy statements and feats within it. So keep your eyes peeled on the horizon for that video. But regardless, Gork and Mork just don't scale above him. We've never seen them calm the warp on such a scale like the Emperor does throughout the Plague Wars, and we've never seen Gork and Mork outright wound a Chaos God, like the Emperor did in Godblight. As for the Catan, I've already discussed this issue before. Gork and Mork are warp beings, and so they can't truly interact with the material universe in their current state, meaning a direct comparison between the two is rather difficult. However, if we are judging the two based on the current feats we have, honestly I think a fully formed Catan still has the advantage. The reason is quite simple. We just don't have enough feats for Gork and Mork. We know the Catan were able to destroy star systems and races on a whim. And while I'm sure Gork and Mork could do similar feats, we don't explicitly know that, since we never see them in action. I have seen many people argue that the statement, calling them divine powerhouses who can shrug off attacks from other gods, must mean they are automatically on the same level if not stronger than the Chaos Gods, or the Emperor and 40k. But even taking that statement at its absolute highest interpretation, it would only prove that Gork and Mork can withstand the attacks and conflicts of other gods. It does not necessarily prove they are stronger than them. Still, at the end of the day, Gork and Mork are absolutely among the strongest beings in all of 40k. They are still ancient warp entities empowered by the entire orc race, and powerful enough to exist within the same conversation as the greatest gods in the setting. But based on the feats we currently have, they sit at the bottom of the god tier. And there we have it, the power of Gork and Mork. The twin gods of the orcs, the embodiment of everything that makes the greenskin race what it is. Brutal, cunning, violent, and absolutely balls to the walls. While they may not have the endless list of feats that the Chaos Gods or other top entities like the Emperor have, there is no denying that Gork and Mork are some proper gits. Maybe one day we'll finally get to see what happens when the Great Green Gods truly enter the battlefield. But until then, they'll sit at the bottom of the god tier. And speaking of other orcs, remember if this video hits 1,000 likes and 300 comments within the first week, I'll make a follow-up video power scaling the Great Green Prophet himself, Gazgul Mak Urak Vraka, the greatest orc warboss of the modern era, the chosen champion of Gork and Mork, and quite possibly the closest thing the Greenskins have to a mother frickin' Primarch. As always, a huge shout out to my Patreon and YouTube members. Impossy Paul, Tyler Pick 7, Musty, Keydry, Seth Capazilla, Lag, Simply Pain, 66, Caleb White, Dinkleberry, Jack Roar, Morally Bankrupt, 1461, Ritter S, Anish Chatterjee, Luke Price, and Diomedes, 22. I appreciate each and every one of you. You all deserve 1 million milks. Thanks for watching this installment of A Falling Cow. Stay milked, fellas, and make sure you yell whack at your nearest bowling alley.